Hello, everyone, and welcome to Calm, Confident, Hired, your guide to overcoming interview anxiety. In this webinar, my name is Madeline Springle, and I am a job interview coach, and we're going to cover some of the things that you can look forward to today. So, we'll talk about some of my background and interview experience and why I love talking about interviews. I want to understand your specific challenges and struggles with interview anxiety, and really why are you here? What are you hoping to get out of this session? We will cover practical strategies like the vocal warm-ups, shifting your mindset, and calming your interview nerves. And then lastly, I will introduce my Master Your Interview Accelerator program and just highlight some of the things that we would cover in one-on-one coaching. So, I am Madeline, and I am an interview coach at Master Your Interview. And my goal is to help job candidates feel confident for their interviews. And it's easier said than done. Job interviews are such a common, basically ubiquitous part of the hiring process across all different types of organizations. And it's really tough because there's so much pressure and anxiety that can be related to doing well on an interview, and there's that gatekeeping element to it. So I am also a PhD student in industrial organizational psychology, and this is basically the science of making the workplace better. I am a certified human resources professional. I have worked in HR and conducted interviews across a variety of different positions. And then I also publish research and present at international conferences on interviews. So whether that's one-way video interviews, technical interviews, or just interview anxiety, this is something that's really, really close to my heart. So the question I want to start off is asking everyone, what is your biggest challenge with overcoming interview anxiety? Why are you here? What are you hoping to get out of this? And there's so many pieces to interview anxiety that it's tough to narrow it down to one thing, but I will monitor the chat here. So I see someone saying, they struggle with providing answers to some questions. Yes, absolutely. You might be asked a question in an interview and you don't know how to respond. So what do you do when you're asked a question that is stuck? It's challenging for you. I'm also seeing answering unknown questions, answering behavioral questions correctly. And so behavioral versus situational questions are two types of the common interview questions. So behavioral questions are those ones that are, tell me a time when you did this, when you solved a problem, when you handled a stressful situation. And the situational questions are more hypothetical. So those are, what would you do in this situation? What would you do if you found out a coworker was stealing or something? So behavioral questions can be really tough because you might not have a time when you did this, and you might not really know how to answer that question, but oftentimes what that question is looking for is, do you have a relevant or a similar experience that you can apply to this one? And we do this because past behavior predicts future behavior. So that's why interviewers ask about your past behavior. I am also seeing someone say they get nervous because they want to succeed. Absolutely. We put so much emphasis on that outcome of getting the job, and that's why we have that interview anxiety, which we will dive into later. I hate it when I can't think of an example. No matter how prepared I know I am, I still feel like my answers are wrong or not clear. And this is a good one. There's that element of either, okay, I've forgotten everything I've prepared and it just all goes out the window, or I've done the research, I've practiced, I've prepped and everything, but I still feel like I can't confidently convey my experience. Excellent. So, with that being said, I want to know if you struggle with any of these. So, do you feel as though your interview nerves take over during the interview? That you forget everything you've prepared for? That you know you can do better, but you're just not sure how? Or maybe you struggle to feel confident and think you don't deserve to be here in the interview. The entire time you're just thinking, why am I here? I don't know what I'm doing, all of those things. The good news is that All of these can be shifted with the right mindset strategies. And that's why I love interview coaching because I genuinely believe that every candidate can overcome these mental barriers and actually confidently succeed and ace their interview. But you got to have the right mindset strategies in place. So, part one that I want to cover today is the pre-interview preparation. And often when we think of interview prep, we're thinking of, am I researching the company? Have I, uh, do I know the organizational culture? Do I know the job description and maybe the types of questions that I'm going to be asked? But a lot of pre-interview prep is actually physical and mental. And so I want to ask you, do you have a vocal warm-up routine? So, warming up your voice. The reason why this is so important is because when we're nervous, our voice can sometimes escape us. This is why you get those voice voice cracks in there and you feel like, "Oh, this isn't actually how I normally talk. What's happening there?" So, when we're warming up our breath, we want to remove anything that can restrict our breathing. So, our goal is to feel elastic and relaxed and to drop our breath into our body. So, what we're going to do is in this pre-interview warm up, before your interview, maybe you're doing this in the car, maybe you're doing this before you log on to the Zoom interview, but just take 10 minutes, breathe into your hands. So, put your hands on your ribs, and you want to create this space to drop your breath. So, big breath, and you're going to push it down. So, we're going to do this 5 times. If I'm pushing this down, you might spit. That's okay. Really expanding your diaphragm. And this allows us to breathe from the bottom rather than the shallow breathing that can often happen when we get nervous. So, number two, this is the librarian shush. So, this is where you're going to put your hands over your heads and you're going to exhale and move this sound forward. So, shh, 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 shh. Shh, 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 shh. And so this just helps us like feel like that breath's moving forward, which is so important for not getting stuck in our throat. The swirly breath is another awesome one. This one's easier to do if you're in like a subtle location and you don't have a lot of maybe movement to move your hands. So this one is where you are following your breath as you swirl it down. So getting that in, down. And the last one is just panting like a dog, letting all that carbon dioxide out. So letting it out. So now that our breath is warmed up, we are going to work on our voice placement. And one of the key things for speaking confidently is moving that voice forward. So, for background, voice or sounds tend to move better on harder surfaces than soft. So, when we look at our face, we've got a lot of hard surfaces like the roof of our mouth, our nose, forehead, but with the soft spots are like our tongue, our lips. So, we want that sound to move really sharply forward. So another thing is often in Canadian dialect, we will soften the end of our sentence so that it kind of trails off. And this can make it hard to really hear the last part of what someone's saying, but also it doesn't make someone sound really confident either if they just kind of trail off an end. So we want to make sure we're always pushing our sound and our breath forward to the listener. So we're going to start by sending a long ah sound. So ah, ah. Then let's pitch the ah from low to high. Ah, ah. Now, intonation is a really interesting one. This is where you're singing the world's most boring song. So, our song can be I Will Overcome Interview Anxiety. So, you're going to sing it in different pitches. So, let's start with the middle. I can overcome interview anxiety. I can overcome interview anxiety. I can overcome interview anxiety. So you're getting this intonation where you're speaking at your normal range, but you're also going at the low and the high end. And the reason you want to warm this up is because in an interview, you might end up in one of those ranges and you don't want to feel that voice crack of like, oh, I'm not used to speaking here and it sounds like it. So, resonance is where you warm up different vocal ranges. And the best way to do this is by humming. So, just humming, getting that middle sound and or that consistent tone all the way out. So, find your middle range. So, mm. So, I'm talking normally at this kind of cadence. If I were to talk really low, that would sound off, or really high, that would also sound off. So everyone has their natural cadence where they like to speak. So to warm up those low and high resonators, that's another piece. So ma, ga, zoo, ma, ga, zoo. So that helps build that lower resonator warmth. And higher ones are may, me, ki. You can feel it. It's higher up in your voice. So, lastly, articulators. This is where our sense of speech comes from. This helps us differentiate our words and our diction in order to sound really accurate in our speech. So, the more specific we are in our diction, the easier it is for our listener to understand what we're saying. So we're gonna practice warming up the articulators. So mm, va, va, za, ba, ba. You can feel that, the pop after the ba. Da, da, pa, 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 ba, 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 ta, 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 da, 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 da. Wow, wow, wow. And so all of these are different sounds that our mouth makes when we're speaking. So I just want to say thank you to the University of Calgary for providing all of those warm-up vocal exercises. I've used those in my public speaking competitions, and they've been so helpful for feeling confident when you're speaking on stage, when the nerves are really high, maybe your script's completely memorized, and it's easy to let your nerves kind of like take over the vocal range. But I found those exercises to be super helpful. So by taking a pre-interview warm-up 10, let's call it, before your interview, and going through some of those exercises, it will immediately help you feel warmed. So part two is still in the pre-interview warm-up stage, but now we're talking about the power of visualization. And this is where we are using interview anxiety to our advantage. So imagine the worst possible outcome. Before high performance athletes actually perform, so think like Michael Phelps, he'll use visualization as part of the mental training for the competition. And what we're going to do is imagine a completely disastrous interview. So, the worst possible scenario. You forget everything you prepared. You can't log into Zoom. You can't find the parking, whatever happens. You eventually get there. You're asked a really tough question. You don't know how to answer. Your mind goes blank. You forget how to talk. You can't speak. You're so nervous. You blank out completely. What is the worst that can happen? Is that experience really frustrating? Yes. Is it embarrassing? Maybe. But you learn from this for next time and move on. The situation has happened. There's nothing that can be done to remedy the situation. It is what it is. But you can learn from this and move on for next time and realize that this experience will build your strength. And that is the power of visualization. It's figuring out what you can and can't control and then letting that go. And so much of anxiety, so specifically interview anxiety, is this feeling of being trapped and that you're just like stuck with the fear of all of the things that can go wrong. And it's really paralyzing at times. And so, what the negative visualization does is it allows us to think like, what would happen if the worst case happened? What would happen? Would my family still love me if I bombed my interview? Most likely, hopefully, probably. Would I die? No, you're not going to die. And that's probably the worst that can happen. And so as a result, everything else is more manageable when we lean into that. Now, it's also important to imagine the best possible outcome. So before your interview, you need to think about how you can achieve your goal. Specifically, what is your goal? What is the goal that you're striving towards? What is the best possible outcome for this interview? Is it that you confidently answer each question, even ones you don't know? You feel really calm, you feel really prepared, you feel genuine and authentic, and that this is a really good fit. And then right after you're offered the job, maybe that's the best possible outcome. And if you've done the work, so you've practiced, you've prepped, you feel ready, why can't you ace your interview? So often we don't allow ourselves to envision the best outcome and actually take hold of that. And this is why the flip side of envisioning the best possible outcome and visualizing that is actually the other half that's so important. So the interview anxiety can cause that fear of failure to take over. But when you allow yourself to envision the best scenario, you are then striving towards that goal. And the other thing with visualization is you want to become familiar with that outcome. You want to know what it feels like. And this is where being specific is really important. So, what kind of thoughts, feelings, emotions are you experiencing when it's going well? And I say here when, not if. When it's going well, what does that look like? What does your environment feel like? How does your body feel? Lean into this like mental preparation so that you know when you're doing well. Okay, so for part three, how to handle interview anxiety in the moment, we're going to talk about calming your interview nerves and shifting your mindset to focus on what matters. So, when it comes to calming your interview nerves, the key thing here at the very, very root of it is we need to look at what is the purpose of anxiety. And that involves recognizing that anxiety is a survival mechanism, highlighting that we value the outcome and we want it to go well. We see an outcome, we see us getting the job. We know that an interview is that gap between us and our desired outcome, and we value that outcome. So that's why we're nervous because we've placed a specific, we recognize the barrier that's existing between us and that goal. And so when you view anxiety as a positive trigger, indicating that you value something, this can help reshift anxiety as a tool or a friend rather than something that's out to get you. Now, the key piece of this is keeping that anxiety in check, making sure that it's realistic, making sure that we're not too overly anxious for something. So imagine, for example, that you're not anxious at all. There's no interview anxiety whatsoever. What does this actually mean? It either means that you don't value the goal, you don't really care if you get the job, or it means that the gap between you and that end goal is so small it doesn't really exist. So maybe that's because you know you're confidently prepared, you know that you're going to ace this no matter what, you know it'll be easy peasy. However, it's important to recognize if you're not feeling anxious, why might that be the case? Sometimes it is because you don't really care. And so typically, feeling anxious for something to a moderate degree is good. So you're in the interview and you are starting to panic. What do? I want you to go back to some of these breathing exercises and remember it all comes down to breath. So start by slow, deep breaths. You need to stay grounded. Keep both feet flat on the floor. That actually helps more than we realize. Keep your feet flat on the floor. And then remember to breathe. You want to recenter your focus to what you're doing right now. So you're answering the question. Remember as well that everything can be slowed down. So oftentimes when I'm working with clients, they will respond to an interview question in the same way. So they'll answer that question, they'll answer every interview question like, "Oh, that's a good question. That's a good question. Oh, that's a good question." And the problem with answering it this way is you are providing, there's a couple of issues. You're providing a value statement on the interviewer's question. You're saying, that's a good question, as in, that's a bad question. And it's like, who are you to tell the interviewer that their question is good? But this is the thing, you don't really mean it because what you're doing is you're saying it after every single, well, you're saying it before every single response. So every question is a good question in your eyes. So what's really happening? You are trying to buy time to answer your question in a way that will allow you to think through. So by saying some kind of filler statement, like, that's a good question, or, oh, interesting. Oh, interesting. Or another one might be, oh, let me think about that. And that one's not as bad, but more so when it's the same statement over and over again, you need to assess why are you saying this? You're saying this to buy time. Fair. You have time to answer your question. You shouldn't feel the need to respond immediately. And I would almost argue that if you're responding to the question right away without even thinking through your response, it's almost unnatural. I find on the interviewer side, yes, maybe I've asked a question where the candidate knows the answer, they've prepped, they're good. But other times, maybe they just feel this need to start answering right away, and that can be a problem. The other thing to think about is that the interviewer knows that you've prepared. It's this arms race between the interviewer asking questions that'll stump you, you feeling prepared to answer any question till you've prepared every single possible question, and they're still trying to stump you. They're trying to see what can we poke holes at that will fall apart. So I'll also see this as a common issue with clients where job candidates will answer questions that they know really well, really quickly. Succinct, clear, answer, fast, all of those things. When they don't know the answer, the problem is that they will stutter a lot, slow down, the flow is way worse. It's like kind of jagged in how it's coming across. And this is a problem because it's very clear from your really good succinct answers to your not so strong ones that there's a huge gap here. And what I recommend is you slow down all of your responses so that when you don't know how to approach something, it's not immediately as obvious. So, all that to say is take the time to think through your answer. You have more time than you realize. You're allowed to thoughtfully respond, thoughtfully think through something. And by taking that time, it'll also allow you to make sure that you're choosing the best story for this example. Make sure that you're thinking through something that will make sense rather than feeling rushed to commit to a story and then boom, you're like, oh, this actually didn't fit too well. So, number three, anxiety often tells us that we could have done better. And what happens with interview anxiety is it causes you to stay stuck in that last question and to constantly be thinking like, oh, I should have said this. Why didn't I say that example? Or like, oh, I don't know if they liked my answer. And this is such a problem when it comes to interviews because you need to be so focused and mentally present for your current question. So, what you need to do is let go of that last question. I always use the sports game analogy. It's like you're playing tennis, it's a brand new point. Doesn't matter whether you won or lost the last point. What matters is how you're doing for this current one. You haven't won it yet, but you have the potential to win it. The last point has already happened. We know the outcome of that one, but this one you don't know. And so with interviews, it's the same thing. Doesn't really matter whether you aced your last question or you bombed it. What matters is this question, how you're going to respond. At the same time, anxiety can also cause us to be really stressed about the future. So you're either stuck in the past, you're stuck in the future. So you're worried about, oh, am I going to be asked this? Am I going to be, am I going to run out of stories for that example and that kind of thing? And so what you need to do is again, recenter, refocus on what's the question I'm being asked? Do I have a good example? What am I going to say? And go through your story and then wrap it up. Wrap it up, end it, and don't rely on the interviewer's body language to tell you how you're doing. A lot of the times as well, candidates will feel this need to think like, oh, like I don't think they like my answer. They like didn't really give me a lot of warmth. But as an interviewer myself, you're not going to share with the candidate whether their response was good or bad. Most likely, I'm assuming others are like this as well. You're going to give a warm, nodding, like encouraging response, regardless of whether their answer was spot on or completely off, because your goal as an interviewer is to help the candidate feel warmed, feel open, feel ready to kind of share a little bit more about them because that's what the interview is for. So, handling interview anxiety in the moment. Here are some other things to really think about. One of the issues with interview anxiety, or let's say interviews more generally, people struggle with self-promotion. This is a really hard thing to do because with interviews, you are tasked with talking about your skills and experience and promoting yourself. And it can feel so uncomfortable for many people to talk about yourself in a way that feels authentic but not boastful. So, what I often recommend to job candidates is that you think of yourself in third person. So imagine that you are speaking about your accomplishments as though it was someone else. So I'm not talking about Madeline. I am talking about someone else's accomplishments that just so happen to be mine. Does that feel different? And why is that the case? It's because you're able to dissociate from this is how I'm feeling, this is how I'm presenting, to like, oh, I'm just talking about the facts and objective pieces of this situation. So pretend, for example, that you're promoting a friend instead. That will help that self-promotion feel a little bit more natural. So if you're speaking about your friend's accomplishments, not your own, how does that feel for feeling authentic? And hopefully that will make a difference. And you need to remember, if you don't advocate for yourself in an interview, no one is going to do this for you. Your friend isn't going to do the interview for you, unfortunately. You have to do this. And as a result of this, you have to be the one to advocate for yourself. So, yes, interviews are very uncomfortable. Self-promotion is uncomfortable. Yes, it can feel unnatural, but it's actually expected by the interviewer. And this is what we call interview scripts. So these are like the unspoken rules of the interview. There's a lot of research on what are interview scripts? What do interviewers expect of candidates? And the truth is they expect candidates to self-promote. They expect themselves to be boastful in a way that is true and accurate. And it's always important to remember, and this ties into that imposter syndrome piece, that you've been offered an interview because someone thinks that you have a chance and might be a good fit for this role. So when you're in the interview and you're thinking like, I don't know why I'm here, well, you've been offered an interview. So according to the interview scripts, they're expecting you to promote yourself about why you're a good fit for this role. So you need to lean into that expectation. So, I would love to know now, how are you going to approach anxiety differently? So, pop it in the chat. Let's hear first. Which mindset shifts are you going to implement in your interview? So, I see someone here say probably implementing different breathing techniques. That is awesome. Yes, absolutely. I think the breathing piece is so overlooked when it comes to both interview anxiety and just warming up. Someone else loved the voice prep exercises. Someone breathe and don't think about what happened in the last question. Focus on answering the question in the current moment. That is such an important one. And I think when it comes to the stress of interview anxiety, that is where people get tripped up. And for myself as well in interviews. If I get stuck on the last question, it stops me from allowing to be fully present in this current one. Someone else said, um, paying attention to where your cognitive awareness is in the present moment, present question, rather than looking forward or back. Totally, absolutely. The breathing preparations and the part about allowing yourself time to answer. Yes, I cannot emphasize how much job candidates feel this pressure to respond. And yes, there's a social appropriateness level. You don't want to take too long. But at the same time, what's long to you is probably not even noticeable to the interviewer. That's something I think is really interesting. So, the practical tools that were most helpful, I'm seeing the breathing exercises a lot, which is awesome. And then, what's been an aha moment for you? What do you now see differently? So, taking a second to think about the question before answering, absolutely. Yeah, allowing yourself time to answer. This is great. And so imagine in your next interview that instead of feeling really stressed, really anxious, and confused, you actually feel confident, prepared, and excited for your interview. This can be you, and there is a way to get there. So imagine if you had the right framework and tools to make a really, really strong first impression. How would this impact your career? Oopsies. Why do you want to nail your interview? Why is it actually important for us to do well in an interview? And that goes all the way back to that distance between the goal that we want and the value that we have on that, and that gap to where we are now. And if there's one thing that's almost always going to be the case, that if you're going to land a job, you're going to have some kind of interview in order to get there. And this is what I'd like to introduce my program to help you get there. So, Master Your Interview Accelerator is where we work together to build your interview confidence, reduce your imposter syndrome so you land your dream job. And this is one-on-one personalized 6-week coaching program to help you ace your interview. So, within this program, I want you to imagine this outcome that you are able to strategically and accurately describe your personality in the workplace. And we will do that through this personality assessment that I use. It's designed by Adam Grant, famous organizational psychologist, and Ray Dalio, investment banker, as well as Brian Little, who's huge researcher in personality. And we will dive into what are your strengths? What are your growth areas? How do you show up in the workplace? What are your ways that you operate and interact with other people? And the reason that is important is because an interview is all about knowing who you are, having that self-awareness, and being able to talk about that. So imagine that you're asked a challenging interview question and you calmly think on the spot and confidently respond. Also, imagine that instead of dreading your interview, you're actually looking forward to it because you know that this is the opportunity to highlight your skills and experience. And imagine that if you're not a good fit for a role, or sorry, instead of feeling like you're not a good fit for this role, you have so many interview offers that you get to choose your dream job. And that highlights that imposter syndrome piece where we feel like maybe we're not a good fit, but instead, you know you're a good fit for the job offers that you have been applying for, and you can then choose where you want to go. So, with this program, it is right for you if you absolutely dread interviews and that is preventing you from going after the career you want and the career you know you need. It's also right for you if you feel like you're missing out on opportunities and you're tired of living with this regret. And regret is such an interesting feeling, but you know when you have experienced regret over something you did or didn't do. This program is correct in the sense that it'll help you struggle with imposter syndrome in interviews. Maybe correct isn't the right word, but it's right for you if imposter syndrome is not going away no matter how many interviews you're doing. And as well, if you're really struggling to frame your experience, talk about yourself, we will work together to help you get to that end goal. So, what would this outcome actually mean to you? Like, what does it mean to feel calm and prepared and confident for your interview? It's going to be different for everyone. Everyone starts at different stages and has different skills and abilities. And this is particularly highlighted with interviews. So, for you, what does that piece mean if you were to actually ace your interview? What does it mean to answer questions that are going to impress the hiring manager? And what does it even mean to impress? Are you impressing yourself in the sense that you are able to feel like you've done a really strong job? And it doesn't matter what the interviewer actually thinks of you, you know you've done the best you can. And what would it mean to know exactly how to respond, even to really tough questions that you have no idea what to do? So you're asked a question, the interviewer has found a loophole, and now you're stuck because you don't know what to say. And we will dive into how to approach those kind of questions. This is the good news. It does not take forever, and across 6 weeks, you can change the trajectory of your career. You can feel much more confident in interviews. You can get that desired outcome, which is confidently acing your interview to land your dream job. And so I just want to talk about two clients that I've worked with. So here specifically, Helen came to me and she was really struggling with a lot of the social anxiety pieces of interviews because a lot of interviews have been online since COVID. They have not come back in person, and it's really hard to develop that rapport and that feeling of connectedness. Like you're actually talking to the camera, not the screen. And so, as a result of that, Helen felt pretty reliant on a script. And this is the problem with virtual interviews is you can have all of your notes on there. And so, we worked together to build her confidence so that she knew the exact stories she was going to draw on. And we used the personality assessment to talk about her strengths, talk about how she likes to show up in the workplace. And this helped build her confidence. She found it really useful, and she's able to confidently go into these interviews in a newer industry that she doesn't have a lot of work experience in, but she's really excited to translate her past research and skill set into this new area. Meanwhile, Sarah came to me and she was feeling fairly confident with interviews, but really struggling to structure her stories in a way that was engaging for the interviewer. And sometimes I see this a lot where people they have their stories, but it's really hard to get from all of the different star interview technique outcomes in an engaging and compelling and succinct way. And so we work together to highlight what's important to share, what's not important to share. And now she can go into her interviews feeling more confident with this example is really relevant, but those details aren't as important. And so the only difference between these job candidates and you is that they took action to actually make that interview preparation happen. So the question is, are you ready to take action? And I want you to remember that landing your dream job is not for the chosen few. You can actually achieve this too. Anyone, like I was saying at the very beginning, I believe that any job candidate can achieve and master their interview with the right support and strategies. And so, with that, I like to say thank you so much for coming to Calm, Confident, Hired. I hope that these strategies and set shifts were really helpful for everyone and that you can take this into your next interview and feel really confident about it. So, thank you so much.